Manish Sabharwal, the chairman and co-founder at TeamLease Services, joins in on the show. Manish, good to have you on board as always. Now, a majority of the corporate voices that we've been speaking to have been vehemently opposing this lockdown, saying that perhaps what has not been done in the last 14 months cannot be done in the next 14 days. What's your perspective? How are you looking at these curves, particularly when it comes to impacting the overall business sentiment?
I think overall the response to the second wave of COVID is very different from what it was last year. See, doctors and hospitals obviously are not turning people away and have developed some protocols. I think migrants are not as jerky as they were because they went home and they weren't really welcome there. Most of them are back. It reminded them that they weren't running towards cities, they were running away from economic wastelands. But most importantly, companies have digitized their infrastructure to allow some remote working, but most importantly, they've reduced and variabilized their costs and realized in the last 1 year that they're not going to put those costs back in. And I think, as you mentioned, policy has recognized that shareholders don't pay salaries, customers do. And this lives versus livelihood trade-off needs to be handled much better. So instead of a sort of centralized one-size-fits-all lockdown that was probably needed last year in March, this time it's been very decentralized to states, to cities, to localities within cities. So I think that the fear that this is a synchronized national one-size-fits lockdown is not going to happen. And that's really important for the economy.
Okay, fair enough. So let's talk about the hiring activity then. How much has it been impacted due to this potential lockdown? And do you think that this time around organizations are far more prepared? As you said, that it's more localized in nature. This one size fits all is not the approach that they're going for with this second wave. So what is your outlook on the overall hiring activity and how corporates are dealing with it this time round?
I think that the usual suspects are obviously benefited from some structural forces from COVID, right? So the digitization supercycle has really put e-commerce, edtech, and IT services as big hires. I think consumer, whether it's healthcare, FMCG, or even sort of a few other consumer domestic demand now is that pent-up demand. So I'd say that the Jan, Feb, March stability of COVID, or at least the declining of COVID, led at least our 1,200 people that we polled in this hiring intent to say that there was going to be at least a 20-30% hiring intention pick up on April, May, June. Now, obviously, I must acknowledge that this was before the second wave really seemed to peak in early April. It's about animal spirits. But as of now, if you don't have a national lockdown, I think some of the clients also realized that last year they were too jerky in their cutting of people and cutting of capacity. And when it came back, they couldn't handle some of the demand. So I think there's a trade-off right now between resilience and performance that people are struggling with. So I think it's really unmodelable in the short run. But as of now, if we just stick to a few places in Bombay or a few places in Delhi, anyway, Bombay's hiring outlook was among the weakest among the metros, right? So Bangalore, Delhi, and a few other places were leading the employment outlook. And the industries were the obvious ones, which were e-commerce, education, pharma, IT. But I think also, we're starting to see a little less difference between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. 41%, 32%, and 24% is probably the narrowing gap between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 as hiring intentions sort of start converging nationally, right? This is the long tail of the Indian consumer demand, which has also started showing up much more after COVID than before this. So I'd say it's up substantially from the last quarter for this quarter, but obviously this data and this polling was done at the end of the last quarter and the next COVID will. But if we don't have a national lockdown, I still think on average companies are not reacting jerkily because they've learned from last time.
Okay, so at least the scenario on the hiring front seems to be better. I know, Manish, we sound like a broken record because we ask you this question every time you join us on our forum, but just curious to know how you're looking at this overall work from home, work from anywhere concept, because you've always maintained the fact that, majority of India works with their hands and legs, so showing up on the job or on the site is absolutely crucial. But do you think that now there has been at least a change in mindset that we can work from home, that maybe say 20 to 30% of the workforce can work remotely even in the long run? Or do you think that when we see this vaccination process and hopefully things clear out soon, that it's going to be back to business as usual?
I think the cognitive elite and and their employers have recognized that you can't put this toothpaste back in the tube again. There will be flexibility, but the debates I see in companies is should people be allowed to work from home any 2 days of the week, or does the entire company work 2 days a week because of coordination sort of problems? But I must say there is a pushback even among the cognitive elite, right? Working from home becomes living at work. As we've talked about it, there are no partitions, there are no pauses, and I think some of the flexibility that will be the net consequence of COVID and us assimilating digital infrastructure in our work will be balanced by what we are missing and what we have realized we are missing in the last 1 year. So I think there's a sort of barbell going on at the bottom of the pyramid, which is 80% of India's labor force. You can't work from home. Obviously, at the top, people who need to be creative, you need to find discussions, they can't work from home. Now, in the middle, there's a large cognitive elite which can work from home. So I would say, if pre-COVID cognitive elite was 5% work from home, it's about 25 to 30 polling right now among our customers will be steady state. I do think there are some upsides for women's labor force participation for people from small towns, which still haven't been fully factored into this 30-40%. But I think that you're right. Work from home among cognitive elite, among a certain employers, is translating to flexibility. So I don't think, for example, there's going to be an impact in the short run on commercial real estate. Actually, many people with social distance are being forced to take a little more space when you want people in. Now, the weather of the moment is not conducive to this discussion, but I still maintain that, for 90% of the workforce, work from home is not going to be a reality.
Sure. The other thing that I wanted to also speak about, Manish, was the fact that, just so many unicorns have been created even so far this year. That surely promises a lot of hiring opportunities.
I think India, it's horrible to say this, but, we have had a good structural COVID. I know monetary policy and fiscal policy always matter to investors, but, in the long run, monetary and fiscal policy can't change much. It is structural reform. And just what we've seen in banking, just what we've seen in ease of doing business, just what we've seen in education reform. So I think India doesn't have a shortage of land, labor, and capital. You could fit every household in India, give them half an acre, and they would fit into Rajasthan and half of Maharashtra. India doesn't have a shortage of labor. 50% of our labor force is Vela. And it doesn't have a shortage of capital, actually. 90% of savings are in physical assets. And the $80 billion of FDI till Jan this year was the highest in the world, but also a record for India. So I would submit the fourth factor of production, which economists don't understand, is really innovation, entrepreneurship, or what they call the solo residual. So because of these, planning to issue new bank licenses, a new NPCI competitor, to privatization of banks, capital market reform, ease of doing business reform, and of course, education, agriculture, and labor. So I would submit this unicorn phenomena you see is coming from two things. One is India is the only large country with more than 100 million people in the world, which has 20 years of growth ahead of it, partly because of our past sins. And second, in a world of when fixed income becomes no income, 40% of the world's bonds are trading at less than 1%, so you will overvalue growth, and India is one of the few places with growth, right? Japan yesterday raised their retirement age to 70, and their population comes down 1,500 people a day. So I think the unicorn phenomena, of course, is driven by very unique features, but it's also driven by a recognition that in a world where capital is a glut, India is a good place to put your money, and I think this will be reinforced in various other ways over the next year or two.
Morning, Mr. Sabharwal. Nikunj Dalmi also joining in. Mr. Sabharwal, if I look at our organization, I've got some of my team members who are now working remote, who are working from places which in a sense are hard to find on the map of India if you try and point them in one go. My question to you is that now we are going through a phenomenon where wherever there is phone, there is a job. So what kind of jobs do you think the society will create? There is a natural migration which is happening to the society. There was a point in time when mill workers were demanding wage power in the Mumbai and in Maharashtra. Those jobs are not there because mills are not there. Where do you think the society now, because of pandemic, will start creating jobs?
I mean, sector-wise, I think, domestic consumption, sales, customer service, logistics of various kinds and of various skills and of various salary levels will be the sectors which will grow. I obviously worry about India defining urbanization as shoving more people into Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, right? We only have 52 cities with more than 1 million people. China has 375. But I would be careful with saying that jobs will go to 4,000 cities and towns, right? Arguing against cities is arguing against offices, arguing against cities, and argue against cities as against the benefits of coming together. So I think New York's GDP is more than Russia. We've talked about this in the past, New York cities, for a reason. There are benefits to coming together. But I do think this disruption will allow hopefully we'll create 300 cities or 400 cities with more than 1 billion people rather than our 52. Bombay shows what is the challenges of mega cities. So I think the only urbanization phenomena that has been questioned because of COVID is mega cities, right? I mean, Tokyo has 1/3 of Japan's population. So I would submit the mega city proposition has been questioned, but urbanization hasn't. So hopefully Jalandhar, Jammu, Kanpur, Lucknow will become places where it is possible the infrastructure, the law and order, the social infrastructure is possible for the company to have. So I'd say we'd go to 200 or 300 cities rather than the 52 which we have now.
The whole idea on startup, Mr. Sabharwal, unicorns are getting created, capital is abundant, money is coming. The whole concept of cash flow is getting ignored while market share gain is something what investors are appreciating at. What if interest rates, they start ballooning up? What happens if the startup economy or the gig economy starts getting challenged like the way it is getting challenged in Europe? Could that be a death knell for this so-called unicorn jobs or the jobs which perhaps everybody now wants to aspire, that you become a coder, you get a stake in the company goes public, and voila, you hit your jackpot?
I mean, from a labor market, 550 million perspective, only 6 million people right now work for IT services or IT product companies. So I would be careful with saying that IT services is going to move the needle. But so they're only 0.8% of the labor force, but 8% of the GDP of the country. So they're an oasis of high productivity. But I think, this is a very new model for the world. I think that Karl Marx and Thomas Piketty were wrong. Capital doesn't always win over labor. And I think that the new world of work, labor will command a much higher share of either profits or market cap, right? Fixed assets as a percentage of total market cap have never been this low in human history. So intangible assets, human talent. So I would be very careful, because all these startups also right now you're seeing them raise money because they're writing checks to customers. But many of them are building switching costs. Unless we learn to deal with digital monopolies, unless we learn to deal with this whole data privacy or data as a good, I think there are real benefits to grabbing market share. So and obviously 8 out of 10 will fail. There's an old saying about wise society and stupid entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs always overestimate their ability to succeed, but society is better off with 2 out of 10 succeeding. But society doesn't know which 2 out of the 10 will be successful. So you have to have 8 fail. So I'd say no, I wouldn't worry about a backlash. Just back to my earlier point of if you look around the globe, because of our past sins, India is one of the few places with 20 years of growth ahead of it. And, we have to stop the Jai Jaikar of 1991, because China and India had the same per capita GDP in 1991, and now they're 5 times ours. So I think the structural reforms that have happened during COVID and in the last few years are still substantial, but incomplete. But if we finish them, I'm actually think that, we have a real shot at covering up all the distance that we missed over the last few decades.
Mr. Sabharwal, really appreciate your time. Stay safe and thank you for joining us. Markets, meanwhile, if I just